All right. One of the topics that I think all media classes should discuss and learn about is this concept of media convergence. Um, it's something that we encounter every single day, no matter where we get our news from, where we get our entertainment from, and the way that it is conceived and kind of thought about is going to be different. Uh, you know, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, and what it was 5 years ago is very different. So, I really like to make sure that this is a concept that comes up and is something that sort of like is in the background of any conversation that we have, because media convergence kind of explains the way that we consume our news and consume our entertainment in very overlapped and dynamic ways that 20, 30 years ago we didn't. So let's start talking about it. So, what is media convergence? It's a concept that was kind of defined by academic scholar Henry Jenkins, who did a lot of research in what he called participatory cultures, fan cultures, and was very interested in sort of the ways that technology kind of brought um, media of different kinds together. That 40, 50 years ago, you had your televisions, you had your newspapers, you had your radio, and what was on the TV or what was on the radio or in the newspaper was of its own thing. That those medias you could only get on that form of media. Um, if you wanted to read an article from the New York Times, you had to pick up a print copy of the New York Times. If you wanted to watch the 6 o'clock news, you had to turn on the TV at 6 o'clock and catch it then. But today, because the way that we consume content and information has been so much, there's so much convergence when we look, I mean, even at the term here, um, that those things have changed in very drastically, even in the last few years. That what we, watching the local news, we can watch it on a television, but we can also watch it on a phone. We can go to a website for that news station. We can find it in so many different spaces in ways that we have previously not been able to. And so all of this stuff kind of converges in various spaces in ways that is worth considering while we talk about all of these concepts related to media and entertainment and public relations and the news. That this is one of those things that's kind of like behind the scenes affecting every single component of how we consume this content. And so this is Jenkins' own quote here, and what he defines as media convergence is the flow of content across multiple media platforms, which considers the sort of cooperation between media industries, the migratory behavior of audiences, and that all these stories get told, things get sold, and us as consumers, we really can't escape it, right? That we are constantly inundated with content from these various industries in spaces that that we access all at all times. And so, companies have really gotten very savvy with getting us as audiences in those different spaces, that we can follow them on different social media platforms. We can watch them or consume them in those traditional media formats. But we can also um, engage with this as well, right? When you go on Instagram or TikTok or wherever you go these days, that you can find ways to engage with that content. You can like it, you can share it, you can comment, and that is, really sort of the developed concept that is media convergence. Um, so I really think that this quote does kind of explain or kind of emphasize the ways that we're constantly consuming various different things in these similar spaces, and should be considering, what does that mean for us as audiences? What does that do for us as consumers? Um, is it anything we can escape? That's a really good question. But what it does involve is what were previously distinct channels. And so, like I said, you could access the New York Times as a print New York Times newspaper. But in the last 20 so years, 20, 30 years, that technology has caught up with the media formats. And now the New York Times is available online. Um, it's available on their various social media accounts, and it's just part of that evolving media landscape, that, like a print newspaper could not survive if it only existed in its print form. And so it's a response to these changing trends in technology. It's a response to us as audiences and how we want that content, that we're looking for it in those spaces that we can scroll through. We can consume it on our phones, on the go, maybe in bits and pieces, the way that we scroll through social media. That those are factors that have influenced how the industries have responded. So all of those kinds of things, and what it means for us in the future, who knows? But is just sort of how these kinds of things come together today. Um, and so just some more kind of ideas about what media convergence is all about, and is that it allows for that distribution across various platforms, content across many channels and devices as well. Think of something like Disney as an example. Disney is a huge, obviously massive media conglomerate today, that owns not only all of their Disney content and the Disney parks and the products and everything else, but ESPN, ABC, they own part of Hulu. So that influence can be found across content and in different spaces, right? That Disney is not just films, but it's TV shows. They're different kinds of entertainment content, um, news, sports. That is all part of it. And think about how many different places you can engage with that Disney content today. Social media is full of it. You can watch whatever they have on Hulu, and the different channels and programs that are offered on Disney Plus. The parks and all the things you can buy in stores. All of that is part of it. And so what it relies on is that co-creation component, which we're going to really talk about a lot this semester. Um, how do we as audiences react to this content? How do we engage with it? How do we play a role in that creative process? Um, and how do brands how should brands um, involve us as creators within it, within that big process of making this kind of content. And I don't mean content in the like social media sense specifically, but in all of it, right? In the television shows, in the movies, in the experiences, right? That additional content that exists outside of the the just original sort of content that we are getting. So the Star Wars being that big example, and just consider how many different ways you can consume Star Wars content. That they have the films, obviously, but they have series, they have Disney park rides, there's merchandise. So that is what it's important for those brands to get us at every angle, to get us in different spaces, and not just in the film um, side of things, but also in to keep that streaming platform going, to create constant new content for the Star Wars storyline. And so doing that, I think they've been pretty successful, I would say. There's certainly enough of it out there. So that is just one way that media convergence um, enables brands to really keep us interested and engaged with what they create. Some of what makes media convergence to be so interesting and useful for a brand is that it is instantaneous. That we are in a very sort of quickly moving social media landscape, and so brands can put this content out relatively quickly. They can get it on social media, um, with some planning perhaps, but to reach us as audiences in ways that your traditional media formats can't. If you think about a news story written for a newspaper, it's going to come out the next day in the print version. But with media convergence, the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever news platform can get that information to us immediately. Um, We also have things such like the algorithms that create those custom feeds for us, that the timelines that we follow, the accounts that we engage with, cater to our interests. They cater to they what these companies would like us to watch and listen to, and so on, which can be a good or a bad thing, right? When we realize just how much of the content we consume has been catered and created for us specifically, based on that co-creative engagement that that we're expected to do as consumers, right? That we're expected to share and to like and to comment and all that good stuff. All works toward creating uh, more curated content for us. Um, and again, right, this is something that is going to keep us being those creators, which we're going to talk a little more about this later, but this idea of user generated content and citizen journalism, um, are, components too, that we create content for these brands, that we, through our engagement, through our posting, through hashtags and things like that, are also playing a role in what's talked about, what is created, or what kind of message these brands are um, kind of giving us or sending to us. An example of this would be a local news station. 6ABC is a news station in Philadelphia, and South Jersey as well. ABC, any ABC local news station is owned by Disney. Disney owns all the ABC content, so anything on that channel owned by Disney. But if you want to get 6ABC news, that you don't have to wait until the 6 p.m. news hour or the 7 a.m. news hour, that you can get that information at 6abc.com any time of the day. They have a website, they have an app. You can watch it on Hulu, which is again also owned by Disney. All of their social media content, things like Twitter or X, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, all of those platforms, right? And more companies are finding themselves on TikTok these days because that's where the audiences are. Um, Additionally, you have things like journalists that have their own social media accounts, and then the sort of exponential growth of that content when this stuff becomes picked up elsewhere. So it is a huge thing today to be reaching audiences, that there are many, many ways that it's done, that companies, news organizations, brands need to find ways to reach these audiences in all of these spaces, um, and kind of find ways to get our attention where we are, because we are consumed by content and we have lots of information that we are um, continually just that's continually being thrown our way. So it's always, a very important component of any strategy for a news organization, for a brand, for a company, to consider how many ways and how many spaces you can reach your audiences in. Of course, this means that this content is available to us 24/7. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is to be determined. But that, as for us as consumers, gives us lots of freedom for how we consume our news, when we consume it, what information is provided to us. But there are a lot of pressures industry-wise to make that happen. So when we think about the pros and cons of media convergence, that some of the good things that come out of this like overlapping media environment is that we have easier access to information. That's just the obvious answer, right? That we can use an app, or we can get on the internet, or go onto social media and find the information that we're looking for. Um, it provides us a range of content and a lot of things to choose from, right? That we have uh, more to help inform us, more to entertain us, more to you know choose from just in general. But that also means that we are going to be um, inundated with information. That when you think about just how many different accounts you follow and how much time you spend on social media, how much time you spend engaging with this content, that it is a large chunk of our day. So that can be a factor, right? That we're overloaded with information. We're overloaded with news and entertainment and choices and content, that it can be a lot to take in. Um, Not necessarily a bad thing all the time, but sometimes that's, worth taking a step back and thinking about just how much of it is coming to us at any given time. It helps for things like, user convenience, and the user experience, that we are able to access it whenever and wherever we want to. Um, or that we can sit on a plane and stream things from Netflix. Um, that you can do virtual workouts in the middle of a field, that you have access to all of this information, because it is provided to us. It's accessible, it's easy to get to. Um, and so that's great, but that also does things for the disruption of those traditional media models. That For example, that if, anybody can be a journalist, or if anybody can be a content creator in this sort of democratizing of media, that this is a threat to the gatekeepers of traditional journalism. That if we can all kind of post and create content and have audiences and share our ideas and thoughts, then you're threatening sort of the quality. Well, you're threatening the gatekeeping qualities of traditional journalism. So that is also something that kind of plays a role in this. That we're we need to be careful of where we get our information, where we get our content from, because this has become one of the big sort of factors in this media converged space that we live in. And these are just some of the things that we always have to be careful of. But the privacy concerns as well. If you ever kind of take a step back and think about all of the targeted content that you get, things like targeted ads, the algorithm, how does this affect your day to day? How do these things, just the data that we're sharing and we're giving to these big companies, what does it mean for that? Um, so that's kind of a big picture question, but something to always consider. And the accessibility, right? The equity of this kind of way of sharing content. We need access to these technologies. You need a smartphone. You might need an internet connection. And so, what does that mean for populations that don't necessarily have that access? So these are just big questions that we want to think about as we're, kind of getting into this idea of media convergence. Um, so, of the things that media convergence allows for is this overlapping of the different forms of media. Um, Paid, earned, and owned are three of the big ones. Shared media is also a fourth, but for the sake of our conversation here, we'll stick to these three. That when we're talking about different forms of media, when we're talking about different ways that brands operate their um, their kind of presence out there, the companies will use these three different kinds of media to get recognition or attention on their brand. Um, Paid media is going to be your simple sort of advertising, content, right? Things like social media ads. Even if you want to think traditionally, something like a billboard, displays, sponsored content, right, which can kind of be sneaky and look a lot like organic content, but is not. It's content that a company puts out that maybe they've paid somebody to write an article, or they paid somebody to write some sort of review, but is actually content that is going to help your brand. Um, so a sponsored content is going to be anything that, or paid media is going to be anything that the organization is paying for. Your owned media is going to be anything that can be controlled by the organization. So we're a big focus of our conversation this semester is going to be that owned media. So the thing like their websites, social media content, images, videos, right? The stuff that's coming directly from the company, that perhaps is giving some kind of message, giving some sort of image of the company, that is going to be your owned media. And then lastly, you have your earned media. So the earned media is going to be the mentions, the shares, the media coverage of your something that you're promoting. This is the kind of publicity content. Reviews that perhaps unpaid reviews would be earned. Influencers, that's like a kind of uh, a little sort of gray area when it comes to like paid versus earned, but the marketing that comes from the ones that aren't being paid to have good things to say about your products. Um, and in that, right, when these things kind of overlap is where we see that convergence. That there's the overlap in between maybe earned and owned or earned and paid. That is in that overlap is where those medias come together, right? So what was once traditional advertising, like a billboard or an ad in a print in a magazine, now when it shows up on social media or on a website, that's where you see that media convergence. So those are the things that we're going to discuss a lot this semester. And we'll kind of talk a little bit more about these kinds of examples as we keep going. But an example just for the sake of our conversation here, and I'll post these links in Blackboard for you to take a look. But last year, Taco Bell decided that they were going to apologize for their breakfast offerings, which Taco Bell serves breakfast. That's, could be news to you, but they put out this big campaign that that tried to kind of bring awareness to their breakfast. Um, and they hired Pete Davidson to help with that little public apology tour that he did. And so when we look at these examples, you'll see how each of these is different, but the paid example is the ad with Pete Davidson, right? The TV commercial that ran, they paid the money for it, they curated the message, they got that out there. The owned media is going to be your press release, right? Again, um, similar to the paid media, but they own this content, they've owned that message, the press release that they've shared with the world about this partnership with Pete Davidson, the apologies that he's offering, um, this updated breakfast menu that they're going to announce through this campaign here. And then lastly, your earned media. So AV Club, they kind of write about pop culture and entertainment and music and things like that, but they wrote a story about Pete Davidson as the Taco Bell apology spokesperson. So this was something that maybe a journalist caught some sort of, maybe they read the press release or they heard something about it on Twitter, wrote the article. Taco Bell didn't pay the journalist to write the article, but this is your example of earned media, right? It's something that comes as a result of possibly of the other two. And where that media convergence lies is if you read the AV Club article, you'll see the YouTube video, that paid YouTube video that we have at the top here, hyperlinks to other links that'll take you elsewhere, right? So in this AV Club story, it'll take you to a story from USA Today, it'll take you to something from CNN, and then anything that exists on social media, right? If people retweet this or if they say something about it, that exists as that media convergence content. So as we're thinking about this semester, media convergence is going to blur those boundaries between your traditional media forms. That is, it has its pros and cons, like we discussed here. It does allow for more content and more interesting content, but it also means that, what does that mean for us as consumers? What does it mean about the information that we are consuming? But it can be it just is sort of how things are today, right? There's no going back at this point. So what do we do with this new media environment? How do brands and companies adapt to needing to have content and information and whatever it is in so many different spaces? So that's going to be one of the big questions that we have this semester. And it does involve that process of co-creation, right? We are not passive audience members at all. We never were. We definitely aren't today. But how does our engagement, how does our involvement, how does our feedback in general, right? That big kind of idea of feedback shape and influence the kind of content that we are consuming in these spaces. So just some bigger questions to kind of think about as we discuss this concept this semester.